Have you ever wondered why you always end up feeling powerless despite being the good person in every situation? Why you say yes to everyone, never want to hurt anyone's feelings, and pride yourself on your kindness, yet somehow you're the one who gets walked over, overlooked, and taken for granted? Maybe you're exhausted from always being understanding, always being accommodating, always putting others first, while secretly wondering why good people seem to finish last. Let me tell you something that might shatter everything you believe about goodness. Your kindness isn't making you weak because you're doing it wrong. Your kindness is making you weak because you're using it as a shield instead of a sword. And the man who understood this brutal truth 500 years ago wasn't a villain. He was Niccolò Machiavelli, the most misunderstood philosopher in history. You see, when most people hear Machiavelli's name, they think of manipulation, cruelty, ruthless ambition, but that's not what he was teaching. He was teaching something far more dangerous to your comfortable illusions. That good intentions without strategic thinking are not just useless, they're destructive. That virtue without wisdom is often nothing more than weakness dressed in noble clothes. Machiavelli said something that will make you uncomfortable. A man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. Read that again. He's not saying virtue is bad. He's saying that naive virtue in a complex world is a recipe for failure. And if you've been wondering why your goodness doesn't protect you, why it doesn't get you the respect you deserve, why it doesn't create the life you want, this is why. The problem isn't that you're too good. The problem is that you believe goodness alone is enough. But goodness without power is just good intentions. And good intentions, as they say, pave the road to a very specific destination. You believe that if you're kind enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the world will respond in kind. You think that virtue is its own reward, that people will naturally respect and value your goodness. But here's what Machiavelli understood that you're still learning the hard way. The world doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on power dynamics. And until you understand those dynamics, your goodness will be exploited, not celebrated. This is where Machiavelli introduces us to a concept that will change everything. The difference between virtue and virtù. Traditional virtue is being kind, honest, generous, forgiving. Virtù is being effective, adaptable, strategically minded, results-oriented. Most people think these are opposites. Machiavelli knew they had to be partners. Think about it this way. You have a coworker who consistently takes credit for your ideas. Traditional virtue says, be patient, turn the other cheek, focus on your own integrity. But where has that gotten you? Nowhere. Virtù says, document your contributions, speak up in meetings, make your value visible, and yes, sometimes that means making the other person's behavior impossible to ignore. It's not about being cruel, it's about being effective. But you resist this because you've been taught that strategy equals manipulation, that thinking about power dynamics makes you a bad person. And this is exactly where your goodness becomes your prison. As long as you refuse to acknowledge that life is strategic, you'll remain at the mercy of those who understand this better than you do. Machiavelli had another insight that cuts even deeper. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Most people hear this and think it's about deception. It's not. It's about strategic authenticity. It's about understanding that you don't have to reveal every part of yourself to every person in every situation. You're not being fake when you're more reserved with your boss than with your best friend. You're not being manipulative when you choose to highlight your strengths in a job interview rather than your insecurities. You're being strategic about how you present yourself based on context and goals. But somewhere along the way, you were taught that this makes you inauthentic, that real people are the same in every situation. That's not authenticity, that's naivety, and it's costing you everything you want. Here's another truth that will make you squirm. Conflict isn't the enemy of good relationships. Avoiding conflict is. Machiavelli understood that tension and disagreement, when handled skillfully, actually strengthen bonds and create respect. But you've been running from conflict your entire life, haven't you? You smooth things over, you keep the peace, you swallow your words to avoid confrontation. And what has this gotten you? Relationships where people don't really know you, where your needs don't matter, where you're valued for your agreeableness, rather than your actual thoughts and feelings. You've trained everyone around you to expect that you won't push back, won't stand up for yourself, won't create any inconvenience for them. And then you wonder why they don't respect you. The uncomfortable truth is that people don't respect what costs them nothing. They respect what they have to earn, what they can lose, what requires effort to maintain. Your constant availability doesn't make you valuable. It makes you taken for granted. Your endless patience doesn't make you admirable. It makes you invisible. Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Before you recoil in horror, Understand what he really meant. He wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was recognizing that respect based on fear of consequences lasts longer than affection that costs nothing. In your personal life, this translates to something profound. People need to understand that mistreating you has consequences. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or vindictive. It means having boundaries with teeth. It means that when someone consistently disrespects your time, they lose access to it. When someone repeatedly violates your trust, they lose the privilege of your vulnerability. When someone takes you for granted, they discover what life looks like without your contribution. But you struggle with this because you think it makes you mean. You think good people don't operate this way, and this is exactly why good people often live lives of quiet resentment, wondering why their goodness doesn't translate into the life they want. The truth Machiavelli understood is that the world is full of people who will exploit goodness that isn't backed by strength, not because they're evil, but because they're human. And humans, as a rule, take the path of least resistance. If your kindness comes without boundaries, if your generosity comes without limits, if your forgiveness comes without consequences, then you're not encouraging virtue in others. You're enabling their worst impulses. Think about the people in your life who command genuine respect. Are they the ones who never say no, never push back, never create any friction? Or are they the ones who are generous but discerning, kind but firm, loving but not desperate to be loved? They understand something you're still learning. True power comes not from being needed, but from being valued, and value requires scarcity. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight of all. Machiavelli wasn't teaching people to be manipulative. He was teaching them to be conscious, to understand that power dynamics exist whether you acknowledge them or not. To recognize that your refusal to play the game doesn't exempt you from its rules, it just guarantees you'll lose. When you operate from pure traditional virtue, you're operating unconsciously. You're reacting based on how you think you should be, rather than strategically choosing how to be most effective in each situation. You're letting your ego's need to be seen as good override your actual ability to create good outcomes. But when you integrate virtù with virtue, when you combine genuine care with strategic thinking, something magical happens. You stop being the person things happen to and become the person who makes things happen. You stop being at the mercy of other people's choices and start influencing the environment in which those choices are made. You don't become manipulative, you become influential. You don't become cruel, you become effective. You don't lose your goodness. You gain the power to make your goodness matter. The path forward isn't about abandoning your values. It's about upgrading your strategy. It's about understanding that in a world where not everyone operates from pure virtue, your pure virtue needs to be protected, channeled, and expressed through wisdom rather than naive hope. Machiavelli's final gift to you is this understanding. Becoming truly good sometimes requires you to abandon being nicely good. Sometimes protecting what matters most requires you to disappoint people who don't have your best interests at heart. Sometimes creating the life you want requires you to stop asking permission from people who benefit from your powerlessness. Your goodness isn't your weakness. Your unconsciousness about power is your weakness. And the moment you decide to become conscious about it, everything changes. The world doesn't suddenly become fair, but you become equipped to navigate its unfairness. People don't suddenly become more virtuous, but you become better at encouraging virtue and discouraging exploitation. You become someone who can be genuinely good because you're strategically effective. Someone whose kindness creates positive change because it's backed by wisdom. Someone who can be truly generous because you understand the difference between giving and being taken from. That's the dark side of goodness Machiavelli understood. Sometimes the most virtuous thing you can do is refuse to be a victim of your own virtue. And that transformation, that integration of goodness with power, of virtue with virtù, that's where your real life begins.